Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, no, it's going great. How are you doing?
Doing all right. I did a 3-hour debate yesterday for Zero Hedge and the Cato Institute about whether we should abolish the income tax.
What was your take?
No. I mean, you can tax people however you want. Different taxes have different levels of distortion that they introduce into the economy. The income tax is not that bad. It's better than most. There's a few that are better. So if you want, you could abolish that in favor of other things. But the problem is we already have this machinery for doing income tax, including a constitutional amendment that allows it. So it would be a very disruptive switch for almost no economic gain.
And what was their argument? Why do they think it's a good idea?
Oh, so the basic argument of the other guy was that it's politically easy to raise income taxes. And so if you switched income taxes for other taxes, they would be more visible and thus would be politically hard to raise. And so you could starve the beast basically and reduce government spending by having people get too mad about taxes so they refuse to fund the government spending. And so we get a smaller government. That was the basic idea. I think that's wrong. I mean, we've cut taxes a lot, and then we never starved the beast, right? We just kept doing deficits. And so there appears to be some level of government spending or some things that we spend money on that people just demand. And politically, we can't really get rid of those things. And so the question is how to fund those things. And an income tax is probably better than most.
Yeah. Well, that is a good segue. I was thinking about doing a mailbag episode this time because we have some questions that have piled up on some of your writings, unless there's a...
Let's absolutely do that.
Excellent. But first, let me ask one, and that's a segue from this in terms of the size of the government. Any immediate reactions to the Department of Government Efficiency so far? Elon and Vivek's sort of plans or sort of how things have been going, or maybe put differently, if you were also on the council alongside them, where do you think the opportunity is? What would your advice be to them?
Well, I think there's lots of opportunities here. Some government agencies are really, really well run and some are badly run. We saw this in the pandemic. We saw the CDC perform very badly. The FDA performed pretty well, decently well. And BARDA, the Vaccine Development Agency, worked extremely well. And government, we've decided, we as Americans, we collectively decided that government was a dumping ground for, people who aren't the most competent people. That doesn't mean everyone in government's incompetent. There's tons of competent people, but they tend to be the kind of mission-driven, idealists, or people who already made a bunch of money and then went into government just for fun. But the problem is that we also have a lot of people in government who are not very competent because it was sort of this devil's bargain between the right and the left in the 70s. And I talk about this in terms of outsourcing things to NGOs as well. But I think that government, our attitude toward the civil service was part of this. Republicans, conservatives thought private sector is better than public. We don't want our talent going into the public sector. So we're not going to fund high salaries. So like Singapore, you get the best and the brightest because you pay them a lot of money, right? If you work for the Singaporean Economic Development Board or whoever, you get paid a ton of money, but you don't in America. And that was partly because Republicans were like, let's pay the civil service less. But Democrats were like, okay, so we want a whole bunch of jobs, basically like a big jobs program for left-leaning people. And so then they used the civil service for that. But those people, are not necessarily the most competent, dynamic people in the world. And so I think that you have, and of course you weakened the criteria for hiring people. So, when I was trying to do a little, what would you call it? Like a public health, interest group during the pandemic, trying to get better contact tracing. We did this for about 6 months and we were making lots of progress, but whenever we had to interact with anyone from the federal government, it was a giant disaster. They had no idea what was going on. They didn't know how their systems worked at all. They just seemed like, they were eager to meet us, but they did not know how their own systems worked. And they did not, they seemed very uninterested in changing anything from the typical way that they did. I don't want to say that there, obviously there's room in an economy for people like that, or we have to find jobs for people like that in our economy. They're not just going to sit around at home and watch Netflix. But certainly we got to allocate. We have to prioritize and allocate talent to where it's needed most. And if you believe that the civil service is important, which I do, then you should actually allocate better talent to it. And so the question is whether Elon and Vivek are, whether they take the attitude of let's have a super competent civil service like Singapore, or whether they take the attitude of let's just drown the civil service in a bathtub because the private sector is great and we don't need no government and anarcho-capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And so it could go either way, because I'm with Tyler Cowen in, Tyler Cowen's state capacity libertarianism. I think Tyler's absolutely right. And I hope that those people are reading that instead of, just listening to ideologues from the 80s, talk about stuff. Because the idea of what we've seen again and again is that weakening the civil service leads to groups like the groups, not, or these toxic nonprofits filling that gap, right? And then if Republicans don't make the civil service try to hire competent people, Democrats are probably going to use it as a sort of a jobs provision program for, just the masses. And if you believe that the civil service is really important, that's kind of not a great idea. And so I think drowning the government in a bathtub doesn't work. You have to make it competent, like in Singapore. So I hope those guys are looking at Singapore as a model, instead of
Argentina.
Well, yeah. And I can't say that because I haven't actually taken a close look at what Malay has done with the civil service. And I think Malay's done a lot of positive things in other areas. And so I think that, Malay's not stupid. He just has silly hair. And so I don't know that Argentina is a bad example here. By the way, if you want to get someone from Argentina, I have a possible Argentina guest, Martin Lustau. He's an Argentinian politician.
Oh yeah, that'd be cool. Yeah, I mean, they're a case study, an interesting one. So yeah,
Yeah. I've become much more libertarian over the past 4 years.
interesting.
I spent so many years criticizing the problems with libertarianism, at least with the classic like 1980s vintage version, which I encountered a lot in the field of economics. But in the past 4 years, what I've realized is that I realized a couple of things on the cultural social front. I realized that freedom is not going to guard itself,
Right.
and that, there's basically a big movement against freedom all over the world. I think it's basically coming from two things, China and technology. And I wrote a post about this recently about liberalism, which overall says like freedom and dignity. Those are the important values. I don't think it's possible to have a much more interesting definition of liberalism than that. It's just freedom and dignity. And I think that, B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, the famous like bald-headed guy who'd do the crazy experiments on rats and stuff, and say like, we use these reinforcers to make these rats do all these things. That guy wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And, we can re-engineer the human race with like behavioral response things and just treat people like rats in mazes. And it was really dystopian, and I don't like that guy. Although he's an iconic guy who did some interesting experiments, but I don't like his ideas. And I think that China has basically embraced a Skinnerian beyond freedom and dignity idea of reinforcing, like training humans like rats in mazes. And I think that through new technologies such as universal surveillance, especially, the idea of that has become feasible in a way that it wasn't. So we're looking at a new era where, of curbing human freedom. I think in the 20th century, we broadly rejected the idea of curbing human freedom by turning every single human being into like a spy that rats on their neighbors. But what if you could turn every webcam and every smart fridge into a spy that rats on its neighbors, and then have like AI algorithms, penalize or enhance your social credit depending on what you do? I think that's the direction which we're moving. And shout out to the socialist types who worry about surveillance capitalism. It's not just the state that could do this, it's corporations too, but that's sort of, I think, an aside. I think the point is that there is this idea that nobody's articulating this yet, except for a few, really right-wing legal scholars that nobody pays attention to. But nobody's articulating the idea that the 2010s sort of tested the limits of how much we want to embrace human freedom. And that a lot of people came away from the 2010s with the idea that freedom means freedom to commit crimes, to loot stores, to burn things, and to just be a complete asshole online all the time, to dox people, to, form random mobs to end their careers, to basically behave very badly. And, screaming homeless people on the street in San Francisco, fentanyl dealers running wild. The idea that these are the fruits of freedom. That's what you get if you let humans do what they want to do. And you try to give dignity to drug dealers by letting them deal drugs downtown. That's where freedom and dignity takes you. Instead, we need, control. We need, the control of a state and of large corporations to control what we say and what we do. And, or the giant wave of protests in 2019, people have memory hold this now. I need to write yet another post about this. But, in 2019, people went into the streets for various reasons. People went into the streets in Catalonia for Catalan independence. They went into the streets in Chile to change the constitution, which they then went back on and decided not to. They went in the streets in Iraq and Iran to protest those regimes. They went in the streets in Hong Kong, of course, was the biggest protest of all, to protest Chinese domination of Hong Kong. And all these other protests too, that I won't list the names of, but it was all around the world. We had ours in 2020. It was 1 year later. But history, I think, if it remembers this at all, will remember those as being of a piece, being part of the same phenomenon, the same 2 years of protest and just street unrest. But it was all for different reasons, right? It was like they were protesting different things. American BLM protesters didn't give a rat's ass about Catalan independence, or frankly, China. And so, but it was technology, it was social media that people realized you could organize protests over Twitter and over some other things. Telegram was a big one. But social media allow you to organize protests and then sort of transmit your protest ideology and then transmit pictures and videos of the protests to jazz everybody up, to get everybody very excited about the protests. I think that there's been a reaction against them. I think that some of the authoritarianism you see is a reaction against that. And it's this idea that that's what people do with freedom when you give them freedom. They run riot in the street and they turn cities into, jungles. And so we need less freedom and less dignity, because some people don't deserve dignity because they're, like bad people who will push old ladies onto the subway tracks or whatever. So those people don't deserve any dignity. And so I think that notion has not been articulated very well by people on the new right, but people are thinking it, and I think some people we know in tech are thinking it. And so I've become more libertarian because as a reaction to that, I think that, yes, like obviously it's bad when people riot and deal fentanyl and, act like schmucks online. But fundamentally, freedom and dignity are so important that those are small, those are things we can control and we can get rid of. Not get rid of entirely, but we can tamp down quite a lot. But freedom and dignity themselves are so fundamental to our way of life that there's the worry that we might not miss them until they're gone. And so there's that, so socially and culturally I've become much more libertarian in that sense.
Noah, can you flesh out what it would look like if what you're calling for made a comeback a little bit? Like, imagine we become a more libertarian or freer place in the way that you're describing. What could that look like?
What could look like? So one thing is that we could allow small business in America. We could allow people to have their own business. Right now, we throw up huge amounts of red tape. We make it very hard to get like a liquor license. We made it very hard to get permitting. Basically it's a year-long process to set up a small business. What if instead we were like Japan in that we simply said, everyone who wants to start a restaurant or a store, local restaurant or store, gets massive support, and like we'll cut all the red tape and just allow you to do it tomorrow. Here we'll simplify all this permitting. Here's your liquor license, blah, blah. And what if we just did that for small businesses and we created a broad ownership class of people who have their own businesses in cities like San Francisco who have an interest in public order and, cleanliness, but also have an interest in density and foot traffic and walkability, but also fundamentally people who are able to support themselves with their business and independently be self-employed. Your average person isn't going to be able to have like a successful software business that they make, $5 million from, right? That's how your average rich person in America just has like their own little software business or e-commerce business. And that's fine. There's a lot of people like that, but there's room for people to just run a restaurant and make an income of $300K a year, which is rich to most, that's rich to most Americans. It's not rich by our standards. But imagine the freedom from being able to like own your own little piece of capital in America without regulators crushing you. That's economic libertarianism, but it's also social libertarianism because it creates a broad class of people with an interest in an orderly society, but also an interest in a free society. So there's one very positive step is to encourage small business everywhere. Yeah, so that's one idea. Our society, American society, preserved freedom and dignity much more than like China or a lot of these other places. For China, of course, I want social freedom. I want freedom of speech and freedom of religion and all these things that we already enjoy in America. I want those things for China, but for America, I think it's economic libertarianism where we really need to where I've libertarianism in 2011, I felt that libertarianism just meant cut taxes, deregulate the finance industry, and let them like cause a bunch of crises and blow stuff up. And I was like, do we really want more of that? But now I'm like, we need libertarianism at the ground level for small businesses, for people who want to build housing. The YIMBY movement is fundamentally libertarian. I mean, of course, they want to do public housing too. They're not ideological that way, but they certainly want to deregulate housing stuff, and just the NEPA stuff and a lot of the other regulations at the federal level and at state levels, I think are should come away. So I think an era of deregulation of land use, of small business, of local stuff, is upon us and should be upon us. And so I've become much more libertarian watching the Biden administration struggle to get its own policies through its own regulations and contracting requirements was a big, I guess what they say, black belt for me. Watching them fail to get like any EV chargers or rural broadband built, watching high-speed rail fail to get built. That stuff is holding back the government efforts, but it's also holding back the private sector. And for so many years, we were told that it was just a matter of funding. If we just had the will, we'd tax the billionaires, and then we'd fund high-speed rail, and we'd fund chargers, and we'd fund rural broadband, we'd fund all these things, and then we'd have a paradise. But it didn't happen. The Biden administration's great successes have been crowding in private capital, throw a little bit of CHIPS Act money, and then a whole bunch of private companies decide to build a whole bunch of fabs in America. That sort of industrial policy where the government only puts up a little bit of money and then sort of regulatorily clears the way for the private sector, because as you know, CHIPS Act doesn't use NEPA, right? It has NEPA clearance. It doesn't have to go through that. But then that stuff is very effective. But then the stuff where the government actually comes in and does it itself has proven not to be effective. And so that doesn't mean that government will never do anything effectively, because obviously the CHIPS Act is working really well. But what it does mean is that there's a whole lot of regulations out there that really are stopping stuff. And instead of just looking at pages of regulation in the Federal Register, instead of just looking at some sort of bulk measure of regulation, which is what the old Cato-style libertarians do, which is frankly very lazy, what we need to do is what the people at the Institute for Progress are now doing, which is identify the specific regulations that need to come away and have targeted efforts to get rid of that. So they've been looking at land use and permitting. But that's not going to be the only one. There's going to be other, regulations too. And then a bunch of contracting requirements. So going libertarian to that stuff, I think it will be very useful. I think state and local places, there's a lot of effort to be done at the state and local level.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
You like to optimize things. You've chosen the perfect credit card to maximize your travel points, and you always find the fastest route when you drive. Shouldn't you handle your charitable giving the same way? GiveWell spends 50,000 hours every year doing deep dives into different charitable programs to try to find the ways to do the most good for your dollar. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. It's easy to see why the Boston Globe called GiveWell the gold standard for giving. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Go to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Econ 102 at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. Like many of you, I spend a good chunk of my day managing emails and phone calls. And despite being careful about where I share my contact info, somehow the robocalls keep multiplying and my inbox is flooded with spam. It turns out there's a reason for this. Data brokers. These companies don't just collect basic contact info. They're gathering everything from your social security number and financial records to your shopping habits and employment history. Some health insurance companies are now working with data brokers to track your online activity, which could actually affect your insurance rates. Another huge privacy risk are people search sites. These websites publish detailed profiles about you, including your home address, family members' information, and even sensitive details like religious beliefs or political affiliations. This got me thinking about how exposed we all are. Whether you're sending a wire transfer, want to protect against identity theft, or just trying to keep your family's personal details private, that's why I started using Incogni. Here's what makes it different. They automatically handle 5 different types of data brokers: marketing, recruitment, financial information, risk mitigation brokers, and those people search sites. Instead of you having to track down all these companies yourself, and trust me, there are hundreds, Incogni contacts them on your behalf and demands they remove your information. And here's the key. They keep monitoring and removing your data automatically because these brokers often try to collect it again. Incogni protects your data across all your devices, whether you're working from home, a coffee shop, or anywhere with public Wi-Fi. Plus, you can add up to 4 additional family members under their family and friends plan. And they're so confident you'll see the difference in your day-to-day, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code ECON102 at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Incogni.com/econ102.
This is a good segue to a question by Zach Ritter, who says, it's a question on state capacity. He says, our second biggest buckets of spending are on military, and I've heard recently about how we're not prepared for a war with China and how there's a lot of wasteful spending. So where is the solution to build more federal state capacity versus where's the solution to privatize? How should we think about this?
Right. So first of all, the fact is wrong. Military is not our second biggest area of spending. I think it's Medicare, Social Security, and then Medicaid and interest on the debt are then, pretty even with the military. So military is the reason people think it's the biggest is because it looms large in discretionary spending, whereas we've just decided to label social insurance and the welfare state mandatory spending for the most part. Not all of it. Medicaid is still, I think was Medicaid mandatory? I don't even remember. But the point is that military actually isn't that big. So we need to get a lot more bang for the buck in military spending, and we also need to spend more. And those are two things that people need to understand side by side. The reason we need to spend more is because doing things like shifting our military from a counterinsurgency focus, which we were for the whole war on terror, to a focus of deterring and defending against China, that requires money. Someone has to be paid to do that. And we need to stockpile missiles and drones, stockpile a bunch of stuff, and resuscitate the defense industrial base. That's going to take money. So we're going to need to increase spending. At the same time, there's a lot of inefficient stuff that we're spending money on. Most of the inefficiency, by the way, there's 2 big sources of inefficiency. The first is the one everyone knows about, which is us building these big, expensive platforms that we don't really need, like replacing our old aircraft carriers with like the new Ford class. Costs a huge amount of money, but the improvement is actually marginal. Everybody knows about this and everybody talks about this. It's a hoary old talking point. And yes, we need to get that under control, and we need to go for cheap stuff that can be mass produced like drones and missiles. And we need a change in thinking. That's what everyone in the Pentagon is now talking about, right? It goes along with the change in what the goals of war are. We're not going into hunt the Taliban or Iraqi insurgents or ISIS or whatever. We're now going to go into defend islands against Chinese attack with a shit ton of missiles. That's our new mission, basically. And so that requires a big pivot. And I don't want to get in the way of that by talking about other things and saying, well, no, actually, it's this other thing. Because yes, that's very important. But there is this other thing, this big other thing, which is an even bigger source of waste in our defense budget. Deployment. We are spending all this money on having our Navy sail around the world constantly and show the flag everywhere, and having our Army go in and Marines and God knows, Air Force, go in and do little targeted interventions for some African militia or whatever. World police. We are spending a huge amount on world policing functions, and China's not spending anything on that, or at least very, very little now. And so we need to stop that. That's a terrifying thing to say because we've done that for so long that everyone's sort of gotten used to Team America World Police deploying everywhere all the time. And a lot of little conflicts will break out if America doesn't world police. And so we can no longer afford this. We need to stop deploying our military around the world. We need to start, our Navy ships are being run to death because they're just sailing around all the time. No, keep them in port, keep them spruced up and ready to go. Don't sail them around constantly. We're involved in a million little counterinsurgency operations. We still think it's war on terror time, even though radical Islam has lost its appeal. And, you just don't see a lot of people rushing to join ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's not that big a threat. Obviously, we'll have security services continue to go hunt down terrorism and cut off their financing and arrest them and kill them or whatever, right? We'll have a little bit of that, but then the idea that we just have to have our whole global military deployed all the time everywhere has to go away. And that's something people don't talk about, but I plan to start talking about that more. And I think there's a chance the Trump administration is receptive to this because that's where the biggest source of waste in our military spending is.
That makes sense. Do you think Trump is likely to run a budget deficit just like the last presidents have run?
Yeah, he is. And it's not great. I mean, apparently Elon doesn't want to, but I think the limits of the powers of shadow President Elon are real. Like, I think that it's a little bit of wishful thinking to think that Elon is just like pulling the puppet strings of Trump. I don't think he really is. The Onion ran a story that says Trump locks the bathroom door to stop Elon from following him in. I mean, I'm sure Elon has influence, but there's limits to his influence. And Elon wants to cut, wasteful spending. Vivek probably would. I'm not sure how much anyone really listens to. But anyway, but I think that Trump is a populist. He wants to hand out goodies. He loves people to love him. Ultimately, that's why he won the presidency, because he really loves people to love him. He loves adulation in a way similar to Bill Clinton and a little bit Barack Obama. I think that when we talk about charisma for candidates, what we're really talking about is the burning desire to be loved by the masses. And Trump has that. And we can call it populism, but I think that it goes deeper than that. Trump wants everybody to love him. He wants to be Santa Claus. And in American government, Santa Claus means deficits.
So it was basically, what do you make of Bernie's take on the election? It should come as no great surprise that the Democratic Party, which abandoned working class people, would find that the working class has abandoned them. While Democrat leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change. Democrats lost this election because they ignored the justified anger of working class America and became defenders of a rigged economy and political system. And then you started talking about how Bernie had this election his take was wrong, basically.
Yeah, I mean, because, irrespective of the sort of fake economic facts that he cites, it's, America doesn't have a real working class. We use the word working class to describe lower income people. We use it to describe people who didn't go to college. Sometimes we use it to describe people with like blue collar manual jobs, but there's really no sort of unified class consciousness across the working class, across all these various working classes in America. They don't have class consciousness. And so they're not going to join together in resentment of other classes. And so, Bernie's tried to play this game where basically the idea is to stir, class resentment of everybody against the class just one above them. So it's like, the Bernie people are always like, we've got to turn billionaires into millionaires. And they're trying to stir resentment of the billionaire class among the millionaire class. But then they're also stirring resentment of normal people, average people against millionaires. And then it's just this fractal resentment. And the thing is, America is actually a pretty rich country with a tradition of free enterprise and a tradition of some people getting rich and whatever. And like, yeah, some people get mad and some people don't like rich people. But overall, I think that is not nearly as effective in America as it would be in some other countries, maybe, where you had more of a egalitarian sort of thing where no one's supposed to look like they rose above anyone else. And so just trying to constantly stir class resentments among anyone and everyone against the people just above them. Like, A, it's obviously a bad idea for our nation to do that. But B, I just don't think it's going to work. There is no, in my recent post about the working class, I told a humorous anecdote where in 2017, right after Hillary lost to Trump, I was at a house party in Berkeley, and there was this woman who was this law student at Berkeley, and she said something very similar. She said, Hillary lost because Democrats have abandoned the working class. I said, describe someone who's in the working class. I expected her to, describe like some Midwestern guy in a hard hat, a construction worker, blah, blah, stereotypical 1950s kind of person. Instead, she said, okay, suppose there's this woman and she's a sex worker and she has all these student loans and she doesn't know what to do with her humanities degree. That was her description of someone in the working class.
That's not working class.
I mean, I'm not going to say it's not, because I'll just say that if so law students from Berkeley can get up there and say that's working class, we don't have a working class. It means nothing in America. And in fact, if you do polls, you see that most Republicans say they're working class, even if they're upper income people with college degrees. Republicans love to say they're working class. Everybody in the Republican Party thinks they're working class. So like, even the people that Bernie would be stirring resentment against. So there is no real working class. We don't have class consciousness in this country. And so Bernie's approach is going to fail. So the idea that you can just sort of like open head, take out identity politics, slot in the, class resentment politics here, and then just close it and be like, now we're great. No, it's not going to happen. It's just going to, you're still going to be out of touch. You're still going to be a law student at a party who has no idea what anyone's real problems are.
And so it is interesting, by the way, just there are factions on the left, right? Like, one example, a small example, but maybe is like AOC taking pronouns out of her bio, right? That's kind of symbolic, where she's siding with sort of the feminists instead of the, in their conflict with sort of the pro-trans movement, right? And it feels like after this election, all these factions are getting kind of almost relitigated to see which one has more popular appeal. And one of the factions seems more like, old school economic arguments like Bernie versus like more newer style progressives. And it'd be interesting to see, which factions win. Like a friend was telling me today that Rahm Emanuel is trying to, make a significant power push in the DNC, and he'll try to move the party to the center. And there'll be, a lot of knives out and activists trying to prevent him. But it would be interesting to see the various different factions and how they play out as the next election comes closer.
Right. That's right. I think essentially in the Democratic Party, it's factionalized in a way that the Republican Party is not. Although maybe, I don't know, maybe, but the Democratic Party is factionalized. And one of the factions is the leftist faction, which is the Bernie anti-establishment faction. Those people, their ideology, I feel, is very plastic. Yes, they'll spout socialist rhetoric, but ultimately what they care about is just power. They want party power within the Democratic Party. They want to stir basically anti-establishment resentment. I think those people will not win. They will not win. They'll occasionally win citywide offices in San Francisco. They'll not win anything significant, but they'll be loud and a thorn in everybody's side. And now they're just talking about Palestine the whole time, but they'll get back to talking about economic stuff eventually. And so, I guess once Trump destroys Palestine, congratulations, guys, you got what you wanted anyway. But yeah, so there's those guys, and then there's the groups. We've been talking about the groups. It's basically just a bunch of interest and pressure groups, and these folks have treated national politics very much like urban politics. And urban politics is very clientelist. It's who votes for you because who goes door to door and organizes, right? So you can reward those groups with money for voting for you. You can pay off your voters. And so Democrats were trying to do something like this at the national level, and it wasn't really working. They were trying to do policies to pay off every coalition member, also predicated on the idea that the groups that were coming to Democratic staffers and saying, hey, we represent the Latinx community, really represented anybody, like, or the environmental climate groups are a famous example of the groups. These people are all funded by rich people, left-wing rich people. Like, that's who funds the groups. And there's this whole culture of like non-profity, activisty, internal cancellation wars and stuff. And a lot of these groups' funding is getting cut off right now because they all canceled each other and they were all very ineffective and everyone kind of hates them. If you want to improve the Democratic Party, get rich liberals especially in tech, but rich liberals everywhere, to stop funding these groups. Because the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, is superannuated. Everyone's really old. Your average Democratic politician is like a 70-something fundraiser who just glad hands their traditional constituents and raises money all year, because members of Congress are reelected every 2 years. And senators too, to a lesser degree, senators too, but especially Congress people, are elderly fundraisers. Who's actually running the country? 28-year-old staffers who command, armies of 22-year-old junior staffers. Like 28-year-old staffers are running the country because, they're running the Democratic Party. They, and so the groups are not going to Democratic representatives. They're not calling up their congressperson. They're calling up their congressperson's staff. The staffer class who don't understand that someone who comes and claims to be like from the Latinx community doesn't actually represent Hispanic voters. And so this urban politics model is very seductive for these staffers because all the actual people who are nominally in charge are like 70-year-old fundraisers, professional fundraisers. That's what's happened. I don't know how to change that, but I think that this is going to be very difficult to cut through that thicket of groups. And essentially only once rich liberals realize that funding these groups is counterproductive for the Democratic Party will the tap be cut off, and some of this damage will start to be reversed, I think. And so that's gonna happen. And then you're gonna have centrists, who are like the technocratic kind of like Rahm Emanuel type of people, right? And so those people will take the role of the old blue dog Democrats and whatever. And that faction occasionally does win. You had the Democratic Leadership Council or whatever in the late 80s and early 90s, which was basically just centrist Dems getting together in a club, and that produced Bill Clinton. So they did win. And then we got deficit reduction. And then we got, Bill Clinton saying he ended welfare and then increasing EITC so much that it actually cancels out the end of welfare and was actually a much more rational way of giving money to poor people. But, and socialists hate that to this day, but yes, it was good. And so you got Clinton as your, rational centrist them. And honestly, Obama was more from that tradition than people think. Like, Obama empowered the groups, but he was not of the groups, I would say. He routinely stood up to them and just said no to the groups. And so I think that Obama and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and all the politicians of the day were still largely influenced by that centrist bloc that arose in the 80s as a reaction to the continued dominance of Reagan. And, in a way, resist liberalism delays the move to the center. Because if you're like, we're just going to march in the streets and resist, everyone becomes an ally and all the groups become indispensable allies. And that's what happened in the late 2010s in Trump's first term. The Democrats pivoted hard towards the groups because the groups were going to resist. They were going to get out in the street. They were going to fight this. Now I think the fact that Trump won the popular vote and the fact that he won twice, despite January 6th and all this other bullshit he did, this tells Democrats that, like, resistance is futile. Like, in the long term, it's not, because in the long term, Trump will fuck up and he'll make people mad. He'll do dumb shit. And then he will piss people off and bad things will happen. And the country will be ripe to throw the bums out yet again, because that always happens in American politics and in politics everywhere in the world. And so, except Japan and Singapore. But yeah, so then, even in Japan, they occasionally, once in a great while, they'll throw the ruling party out for like 2 years and then they'll be back. I think one time they threw them out for 9 months and then they were back. But Japan is a vibrant democracy. Japan is in some ways more democratic than we are. They have higher turnout. They have more restrictive campaign finance laws. They have, politicians connect with average people more in Japan than they do here because they have to, because they can't just bomb with TV ads and, and also groups are not tax advantaged like they're here. Or at least charities are not tax advantaged. And then, so there aren't as many rich people to do the funding of the group. So Japan's in many ways a healthier democracy than we are. They don't have as much money in politics. They don't have as much like activist group shit. They have just like mafias and construction workers coming and buying votes, or getting votes bought. But so anyway, people throw the bums out. But the point is that I remember in the day after the election in 2016, some leftist guy that my friend knew got on the Facebook wall, because everyone was still arguing about politics on like Facebook walls. He was like, I want this guy out tomorrow. I don't want to wait 4 years. I want him out tomorrow, right now. I need him out of there. And I was like, well, what are you going to do? And he just sputtered. He had no idea. It was like this idea that if you just got angry enough, you could make Trump go away. And honestly, that attitude was reflected in January 6th. It's the idea if you could get angry enough, you could have made Trump have won the 2020 election, but you couldn't. He lost. And so anyway, but Democrats were like this for a long time. Progressives were like this for a long time. If we just get angry enough, there was the women's march, Today, pussy grabs back, and everyone wore a pussy hat and, marched in the street. And just people thought that if they got, I think that just massive, rampant, accusations of various things were used in an attempt to get people out of there sooner. It's like you could reverse the verdict of 2016 if you just got mad enough. And that just didn't work. It didn't work in 2020. Like, people ran through DC burning stuff, and that didn't get Trump out of office. Trump didn't flee to Russia or whatever, like Yanukovych did in Ukraine. I think if Trump had lost this election, there was a chance he might have fled to Russia, and with reason. I don't know though, but there was never any so it never worked. And the point is that Democrats aren't going to do this time around. They've realized that just the get perma mad doesn't actually make Trump go away. And people are exhausted. There was some story in the New York Times. Many Black women, are, instead of politics, are choosing to rest. Rest is a revolutionary act. It just shows a Black woman sleeping on a thing. Well, that's called having a life. That's called not spending 4 more years of your life being mad every day. It runs out of juice. It runs out of money. It runs out of time. It runs out of effort, that kind of culture. And yeah. Am I just ranting?
It's a good rant, though. I'm tempted to say, they ran out of Jews, but I'll take that part out of the podcast. You said
Of Jews?
well, some Jews are Republican. uh,
There was not an appreciable Jewish shift.
oh, really?
Yeah. There was an appreciable shift of Asian people despite having high education levels, but I think there was not an appreciable Jewish shift despite the Israel-Palestine thing, because, anti-Semitism now exists on the left and the right. Like, the left, people on the left will like call you a Zionist and like, deface your synagogue or whatever. And then people on the right, or like slap the yarmulke off your head on Columbia campus or something, right? And people on the right are there like, saying like Hitler was a good guy. Like Tucker Carlson had like a Hitler defender on his podcast. And, people on the right just say anti-Semitic shit all the time. So it's like, who do you vote for? Like the anti-Semitism on the left gave permission to the anti-Semitism on the right to come out of its hidey hole, right? Because like, if you said Hitler was a good guy in 2008, you get fucking mobbed. Like that would be the end of your career, right? You couldn't say that. But now with Palestine being the omni cause that consumed the entire left, like you can say Hitler was right. And people like, maybe people think you're bad because they don't, Hitler was a man of the right. We like our tyrants of the left. There is some bullshit. Like they don't think Hitler's good, those guys, the Palestine protesters. But at the same time, are they really going to go to bat to defend Jews as a class? No, they're not. And so Jews now are unprotected by like the people who voluntarily stand up to protect every minority. Jews have been kicked out of the minority club that gets protected, right?
They're not on the progressive stack.
They're not on the progressive stack, honestly. And Hispanics and Asians are going to kick themselves out of the progressive stack too. Probably gays. Anyway, but yeah, so like they're not in the progressive stack, so there's no one to defend them. So then all the people who sort of like sat around in their house and quietly said like Hitler was a good guy back in like 2008 or 1992 or whenever, right? You had those guys, they were around. You could see them on stormfront.org, right? You could occasionally, they would call into like Michael Savage's show. Like, I think he's Jewish, but he was like right-wing Jew. And people would be like, it's just the Jews, isn't it? And he'd be like, hold up here, son. Anyway.
So that's cold open.
Yeah, because he's like a super right-wing Jew. He'd be calling for a military coup and all this super right-wing stuff in the like early 2000s. And then, I would listen to his show, driving down the road back when people listened to radio shows. And then some guy called in, he was like, it's actually just the Jews, right? And he was like, well, actually, I never thought the leopards would eat my face.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's the thing. Like Jews are now, Jews are homeless in terms of extremes. There's no extreme that will accept Jews. You're kicked off the extreme left, but you're also kicked off the extreme right. So what do? You have to be a moderate.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're always looking for ways to streamline our work. That's why we use Notion for all our internal documents. It's been a game changer for us, and I want to tell you why. Notion is this amazing all-in-one workspace that combines your notes, docs, and projects. But what's really cool is their new Notion AI. It's like having multiple AI tools built right in. You can search, generate, analyze, and chat, all without leaving Notion. What sets Notion AI apart is how it personalizes responses based on your content. It's not just another generic chatbot, it understands the context of your work. Plus, it can search across thousands of docs in seconds, even connecting to tools like Slack and Google Docs. And get this, Notion is used by over half of the Fortune 500 companies. Teams using it send less emails, cancel more meetings, and save time searching for their work. It's designed to keep everyone on the same page while protecting your privacy. Want to give it a try? Head over to notion.com/upstreampod. That's all lowercase. Notion.com/upstreampod. You can try Notion for free, and when you use our link, you're supporting our show. Give the powerful, easy-to-use Notion AI a shot today at notion.com/upstreampod. Our sponsor for today's episode is Carta, the end-to-end accounting platform that's purpose-built to power the strategic impact of the fund CFO. For the first time ever, private fund operators can now leverage their very own bespoke software that's designed from the ground up to bring their whole portfolio together, enabling formations, transactions, and distributions to flow seamlessly and accurately. The end result? A remarkably fast and precise platform that empowers better strategic decision-making and delivers transformational insights on demand, timely K1s, holistic fund performance data, and so much more. Come see the new standard in private fund management at carta.com/investors. That's carta.com/investors.
Yeah, really. Sino, you mentioned, Japan free from corporate interests. How should we look at the legacy of Citizens United? Did it have a massive impact on politics? I was just listening to a podcast with this Young Turks guy, and he's, talking about the biggest problem people aren't talking about is corporate influence in politics. Is that massively overstated? Was it kind of, I remember when Citizens United came out, people were really scared about the impact that the corporations were going to have. How has it played out? And what is data? Is this a major problem?
Honestly, this is one that I don't really know that well, because I do think that money in politics is much less important at the national level than we would be led to believe. I think, Harris outspent Trump, and the bigger money candidate often loses. Bernie outspent all his rivals by a huge amount, and yet got crushed. And so I think at the local level, money matters, especially money matters for these groups, right? I think, and I don't actually know. I don't understand the legality of how Citizens United affected political action committees who don't officially support a candidate, but actually, actually they do. I don't really know how it affected that. And I think the influence of money in politics is considerable, but much less than people talk about.
Right.
So that's a nuanced opinion.
It's not like Exxon is choosing, Trump or Biden or whoever, Meta or Tesla or whatever.
That's right. Now, if you own a social network like Elon Musk, then you get a little more influence.
Yeah. By the way, you wrote about this in one of your pieces recently. You alluded to the what's it called? The Emergent Majority. What's the book that Roy Teixeira wrote?
The Emerging Democratic Majority by John Judas and Roy Teixeira.
Yeah, sort of 20 years ago, saying that the future was bright for Democrats if they could sort of harness this multiracial, democratic, that the demographics were serving their interests. Has that theory turned out to be false, or how do we look at the legacy of that theory?
Absolutely. So, in fact, that's what my latest guest post was about by Durini Srinivas, who you should meet, by the way. She's fun. But anyway, it's basically the idea that Hispanics and Asians were part of a, BIPOC coalition, BIPOC coalition against whites. So there's this idea that the future of the electorate, and this was not John Judas and Roy Teixeira's theory. Those guys just looked at crosstabs. Those guys just said, whoa, look, Hispanics are voting 58%, 60% Democrat. Get more Hispanics and you'll win, just like in California. Well, guess what? The nation isn't quite like California. Newsflash. And Asians, of course, people were like, well, maybe they'll be white adjacent because they make more money than white people. Maybe they'll just want to be white, and then they'll vote Republican. But no. If you ask your average Asian person in America, would you like to be white? They'll be like, no. And so, try this. But at the same time, the conceit that white people voted 55% Republican or whatever, 58% Republican, primarily because of white supremacy. That was always broken. That was always wrong. There were a lot of issues, that people cared about, that white people cared about. And, I think the last Democrat to win white voters was LBJ. So I don't think this whole story of white people vote Republican because of white supremacy. So of course the other races are going to vote Democrat so they can oppose white supremacy, blah, blah, blah. It was never real. That was fake. I mean, there are a few voters who are thinking like that. There's a few voters who think like anything. Some people do think in terms of these racial coalitions, but not many, and certainly not enough, to make a big difference in these national elections. And so now you've got, I think, 54% of Hispanics voting for Harris. That's a much smaller margin. And, I'm sorry. Yeah, 54%. And then around the same percent of Hispanic men actually voted for Trump. So Hispanic men broke for Trump, right? So now to get your little story about your racial realignment, you've got to dive into the crosstabs and say, well, Hispanic women will vote, but actually Hispanic women swung harder toward Trump than Hispanic men did. They just started farther to the left, and then they swung more toward Trump than Hispanic men did. So guess what? That's not part of your racial BIPOC coalition either. They're just normal American people who just want low inflation, opportunity, maybe low regulation, harsh policies against crime that would burn their businesses and neighborhoods. and they just want what normal Americans want. They're normal Americans. They do not see their electoral political life as a race war. They do not vote based on the idea that they, we, the BIPOC coalition, will take power from the whites, and then that's not what's going on. I mean, you do get politics like that in some very poor countries. You get tribal politics where it's I vote for the Kikuyu party in Kenya because you'll give money to the Kikuyu, and in America they just want to kick you out. Oh, sorry, it had to happen. Sorry, Kenyans. But then no, I mean, Americans are it's much more instructive to look at Americans as just Americans than to look at them as part of these imagined racial blocks that you define because you look at a crosstab and say, oh, 55% of this racial group voted Democratic in the last 3 elections. Therefore, this race must be part of our race war coalition to overthrow the bloc. Shut up. No, that's not what most people are thinking about. That's what, maybe that's you got this idea from your area studies class or from chilling with your radical comrades in the dorms at Berkeley. But that's not how most Americans think of their life. And especially most Americans over the age of 40, by the time you're over 40, you're I do not want a race war. I have a business. I have a job. I would not like a race war. I would like slower inflation, please, and some police. And so the notion, and this is a sillier, more ranty version of what Daruni wrote in a guest post on my blog today.
Relatedly, you wrote a few weeks ago that the gender divide is a bit overstated in terms of the Democrat-Republican coalition. Is that still true, or yeah, how would you sort of think about
women move toward Trump in this election? White men move toward Harris. So all the narratives are just pretty broken, and you're gonna have to appeal to people based on it. It's time for Democrats to embrace broad appeals. You've got to ditch this idea that a nation is just like a larger version of a city, and that you can have these local activist groups who represent various communities in the city come to you and basically offer you votes in exchange for patronage. That's not how national politics works. You've got to do broad appeals. It's too expensive to pay off everybody based on their demographic crosstabs. Actually, you know what? There's a really interesting theory about this called Selectorate theory by a political scientist named Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, which, if my Spanish serves me right, means Bruce Goodness of Mesquite. But anyway, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita is one of the premier political scientists of our generation. And also, he's a really good forecaster who contracts to the CIA and forecasts political events really well. But also, he has this Selectorate theory, which basically says that in any country, whether a dictatorship or a one-party state or, Soviet Union or America or democracy, anywhere, has some group of people who selects the leader. The leader is not a Superman. He's not Homelander from The Boys. He doesn't rule through godlike power, right? He rules through a coalition. He has people who support him. And that's the Selectorate, the group of people who have the potential, whose support matters. And in a military state, that's the military. And in a one-party state, it's the party, maybe, the broad party, Chinese Communist Party is 50 million people, I guess. And so that's the Selectorate. And then the winning coalition is a group of the Selectorate, which is big enough to win within the Selectorate. And the question is, how do you buy a winning coalition? And Selectorate theory says that in a dictatorship, you buy people directly. You give money to your cronies. If you have a small Selectorate, if your Selectorate is just the army, then you do what Iran and Egypt and Myanmar and used to be Indonesia do, which is basically have the army be a mafia. And basically the army gets to run all the businesses. So you can buy off the army because no one else matters. You don't care about the people in the street. You just shoot them. You make your money from oil, I don't know, or the Suez Canal. And Indonesia had to stop this kind of politics, but I think Egypt and Iran still have this going strong. Pakistan to some degree has it going, where just the army rules shit and they're the mafia, and you can pay them off. But when you get to a democracy where the Selectorate is the voting public, right, with 100 million people or whatever, when you get to that size of the Selectorate, you can't just buy them off. It gets too expensive. And so Selectorate theory predicts that democracies will be better because they will focus on providing public goods that benefit everyone, even the losers. So the idea is that the public goods will be like infrastructure, rule of law, or, et cetera, et cetera. And so democracies will provide public goods while everyone in an autocracy is focused on just paying off specific individual people and not necessarily providing public goods. This is one of those theories that was made in the 90s and early 2000s when everybody thought like democracy is the best thing ever and we'll win an end of history kind of moment. But I think there's something to it. And I think Democrats have been trying to buy people off too specifically. They've been saying, okay, here's, this group, which this community, quote unquote, which is represented by this activist group that talks to our staffers, or more accurately, about 60 different activist groups, all funded by left-wing tech guys. And so then let's, here's this community, we'll buy them off by doing these different programs. So student loan cancellation was insanely expensive, regressive. Nobody really wanted it, but Biden did it because there were these groups who came and really fought for it hard in order to buy the young people community. And guess what? They shifted toward Trump. Anyways, but that was an attempt to buy off, but it was insanely expensive. So Democrats, they have this idea that you can buy off these, that communities one by one by getting a group, capital G group, to tell you what the community wants and then passing a giant budget item based on what the group tells you the community wants. And it's just not working. Because it's too expensive, the Selectorate theory, but, student loan cancellation being the biggest thing, or various healthcare subsidies. There's all kinds of things that they did. And so then there's that, but then there's also the fact that most American voters don't vote based on, for president based on the direct benefit that they get, right? They vote based on self-expression, because if you think about it, actually, that's almost all elections in the world are based on self-expression, because if you think about it, why would you ever go out and vote for president when the presidency will never, ever be won by a single vote? It can't. If it got to a single vote, the Supreme Court would effectively decide it by deciding which votes are applicably counted. It'd be like Bush Gore, right? So the Supreme Court will not decide this. We'll decide this. One vote will never, ever, ever make the difference in the presidency. So why does everyone go out and vote? Why do 100 million people go out and vote? They vote to express themselves. And if you express yourself, you're expressing principles and ideas. Those are like public goods in the Selectorate theory. Those are broad things that appeal to everybody. Democrats need to stop thinking they can buy off specific groups of voters with payola, essentially, and start doing broad appeals that help everybody in America.
What are examples of that?
So making it easier to build housing is an obvious one. Just competent management, which Democrats have not incredibly done lately, but which will be very attractive once RFK gets going, right? It's hey, under me, your kid will not get measles, right? Appeals to our commonality as Americans. That was what Bill Clinton always did. Bill Clinton would always say, what unites us is more important than what divides us. Americans are united on our values. That was every speech he gave. We're actually united. Did it persuade Republicans to support him? Hell no, it didn't. Did it persuade enough swing voters to support him where he consistently won elections? Hell yes, it did. Right? He just always said what unites us is more important than what divides us. Just talk about basic universal values, freedom, and freedom from fear, like freedom from fear of crime and disorder is a fundamental human freedom. Talk about freedom in international context. Now you have all the right-wing pundits saying, why is Russia our enemy? Well, Russia threatens freedom. China threatens freedom even more. And so talk about freedom. Bring that back. And Kamala Harris did this at the very end of her campaign, but it was way too late and way too little, honestly. But it was just people had already associated her with wokeness, and she didn't. If she had been Ms. Freedom and we're all Americans and like Bill Clinton too, from day one, from 2019, when that was really harshly unpopular, had she done that, she would have been a successful politician more than she was.
And in your piece, you talk about freedom and dignity. What does dignity look like?
Dignity looks like, well, first of all, just not insulting the hell out of people. So saying Haitians eat pets.
Right.
You didn't actually do anything to the Haitians, but you did take away their dignity because you called them a bunch of pet eaters. So just not insulting the hell out of people all the time gives people dignity. Individual rights create dignity. They create freedom, but also dignity. So the idea that you have to be read your rights when you get arrested. The actual reading of those rights is inconsequential, right? No one even knows what the phrase means. It's just a prayer you intone. You have the right to remain silent, blah, blah, blah. What it does is that it gives you dignity by telling you you're a person. Yes, I arrested you for this crime, but I have to do this thing to you, give you this information as if you're a person. I have to do a service for you while I'm arresting you. That's a small bit, yeah, that's like Trump violates people's dignity in important ways. He says nasty things about whole groups of people in ways that make people feel uncomfortable. That wasn't enough to sink him in the election, but it is something people don't like. And Americans don't talk about dignity enough, but Japanese people do. So Americans talk about everything in terms of freedom, the freedom to this, the right to that. Japanese people do not. As a rule, you do see rights, you do see like human rights and stuff be discussed, but more often you'll see dignity. Japanese people view job security as dignity, the dignity of work. We could talk about that, right? Now, that doesn't mean I want to provide make work jobs to people, but you can say like fighting for good working conditions is a form of dignity. And I think that the labor movement presented itself as that in the past, back when Democrats used to win union people, right? Like talking about dignity is not like union people left the Democrats because the Democrats went sectarian. They cared more about like racial grievances than like, the plight of working people. That doesn't mean we need class solidarity and like we're gonna make all the union people hate billionaires and vote. Like Bernie's shit is not gonna work. Like union people don't sit around thinking about how much they hate billionaires. They sit around thinking about like, how do I get society to respect me despite the fact that I like move stuff around with my muscles instead of like trading stocks. Like people want respect. Dignity and respect for the service class is important. Like, all the labor stuff that Biden did quietly, silently, without much fanfare could be trumpeted. We could say, look, do you really want your job to be able to just like say, okay, this week we're not giving you hours. You don't have any, like you could talk about that in terms of security, but you can talk about that in terms of dignity, like the basic dignity afforded to people. Yeah. So like you can do appeals to dignity also. You can even run against, X and some of these platforms. You can say, like, this is a cesspool. Do you really want your nation governed by that cesspool? And that's an appeal to dignity, I believe, because like X is just like you say, even the most reasonable milquetoast thing, and people just screech at you. And like people don't like that. People don't enjoy that. But they also don't enjoy being told that they're, a cultural appropriating white supremacist for wearing a Chinese dress to prom. So that's a dignity issue as well. And so like basically there's all kinds of things that I would classify as appeals to dignity that we don't normally use that word for, but that I think are important.
That's a good description. I'm going to do maybe one or two more questions to get you out of here in a few minutes, but this is from Ian Moffitt. Ian asks,
Hi, Ian. I know Ian.
Ian says, I like you, I'm a YIMBY, and I have a pro-immigration bias. However, I find that most people I meet are not sympathetic to YIMBYism since they don't like it when their neighborhoods change quickly and they want to maintain their neighborhood's cultural character. Therefore, I'm curious if you think there's a trade-off between immigration and building more affordable housing. For instance, do you think reducing immigration would make voters more willing to build affordable housing in their communities?
That's a good question because I don't think reducing immigration will make people want to build more affordable housing. So no, I don't think so. Honestly, immigrants are all very upwardly mobile. And that means that your average poor immigrant is poor because of where they were born, not because, they're on drugs or they had family problems or whatever, or they're just unlucky, right? Or they just, whatever. Immigrants that are poor because they're hardworking and they're going to be not poor soon. So having poor immigrants live near you is actually much safer than having poor native born Americans living near you. I don't know if people see it that way, but that's the truth. And so I don't think that, but what I do think is that I don't see the connection between immigration and housing. I mean, like, obviously immigrants need to be housed somewhere, right? But this is the idea that we're going to make housing affordable by kicking immigrants out. And you may, but the problem is then you also reduce house prices, which are the main source of wealth for the middle class, right? Most Americans' wealth is in their owner-occupied housing. And that owner-occupied housing, the price of that, your wealth, your nest egg, your retirement plan depends on demand for that housing. And if you kick out a bunch of immigrants just to lower rents, you've made life easier for renters, but you've also tanked the wealth of the American middle class. So think about that. Anyway, but then in terms of NIMBYism, I agree that there's a trade-off that some people don't want their communities to change. Some people are afraid that poor people will bring disorder to the neighborhood, etc. The way to solve that is hyperlocal. So Houston has this program where basically small, a few block area can like vote to allow housing just in that tiny area. And Arlington, Virginia has something somewhat similar. Basically, allow the NIMBY blocks to be NIMBY, but only by the block, or maybe like a collection of 6 blocks, like a small area. Allow the NIMBY areas to be NIMBY. Allow the YIMBY areas to be YIMBY because why are they YIMBY? Because their property values will go up from density because, they can like if you own land and stack more apartments, you can like make more money. Right. And so you can make more money. And so they want it, or they want, they have some businesses nearby they want traffic for, or whatever. They just want, and then you can do some property tax sharing where you have micro property tax sharing. So like if you allow density in your little area, then we're going to get, then some of the property taxes that go to the city from that area get rebated to you. So you basically get money from this density. We pay you to be dense. Right. But then if you want to be NIMBY, you can just be NIMBY. Have your quiet streets, have your, suburb within a city. And you can do that. And so micro neighborhoods, I think, are the way forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ian has a related question where he says, I think your recent post about immigration and failures of progressive overreach have been excellent. In regards to democratization of immigration, how far would you be willing to go? For instance, if most voters wanted to establish quotas from certain countries, should policymakers always be obliged to follow suit? As for better or worse, these policies seem very popular among voters. What do you think?
Yeah, of course. We already did that. 1924, we did that. If people want to do that, we can do that. Absolutely. It is within our power in the law. In fact, we already have soft quotas because we have our quotas now are by the size of country. So we massively discriminate against India, China, and other big countries in favor of like, some tiny little countries like Haiti or Jamaica or something, or like Andorra. Basically there's no difficulty immigrating from there. But India, forget it. Like, it's really hard because you're competing against like 1.5 billion other Indian people. So those function as country quotas, right? We have country quotas. They're just the same for every country, which penalizes big countries. We could change that. So if people want to say like, we don't want immigrants from, like Pakistan, like, yeah, you're going to elect people and they will make a law saying no immigrants from Pakistan. Sorry. And yes. And then we might be in trouble because Pakistanis bring a lot of like high skilled immigration talent to America. But I'm just saying, like, you can do this if you want. We did it before and the Supreme Court never struck down. You can do country quotas. You can do what they did in 1924 was actually country quotas based on ancestry, backdated. So they took a date before the big immigration boom from East and South Europe and said, your, quotas are based on how many Americans were living here before that big immigration boom began. So it was intentionally aimed at restoring the demographics of pre-boom America, of like, 1870 America or whatever. And so, and also they then, banned immigration outright from essentially countries they thought were non-white, which didn't include Mexico. Under that law, all Mexicans are white. So because Texans wanted Mexicans to come in to work. So Texans got a carve out for Mexicans. So even indigenous Mexicans are white under our law, or were anyway. But then, and of course, Arabs are white. Anyone from like Egyptian, you're white. So you could come in. And then Africans, we could have had massive African immigration under that law. That was totally legal because of African Americans. And a few Africans even did come, like 5 or 6, but nobody knew, Africans didn't even have like TV at the time. They didn't know that this was possible and they didn't have the money to move over here, generally speaking. And so we didn't get a giant wave of African immigration, but under that law, we could have. The law was eventually struck down in 1965 because they thought, and amended because they thought it was racist, which it was. And there had already been, the racial parts of the law had already actually been formally repealed by Truman, but the ancestry parts, which were de facto racist, were only appealed by Johnson in 1965. And so, but we can go back to that if you want that, like, we can do that. But I don't think we should do that. But it's well within, it's constitutional. It's within the purview of stuff we've done.
Yeah. Maybe one last quick question. This is from Ryan Cobine. He asks, Noah, are you familiar with Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning is Here? What do you think of this generational driver hypothesis as an explanation of certain aspects of his history and society?
Well, I haven't read it. So I can hold forth on things I haven't read because I asked GPT to summarize them and read a million commentaries about them, but you're going to get a second-rate rant. But okay, why not? The idea is that there's generations that tear down institutions and generations that build institutions. And the boomers were the ultimate tear down generation, and that the millennials would be the generation that builds up institutions. Well, guess what? They did. They were very woke. The millennials built a new series of institutions of woke stuff to replace the old stuff. You know, where Nature magazine is wading into political controversies and like the NSF is awarding science grants based on race, et cetera, and things like that. And the new online media of like Teen Vogue saying everything is about capitalism. Those were the institutions that the millennials were building, right? The groups were an institution in American life that we didn't even have a name for until recently. And so that was an institution that millennials were building. Social media stuff. Now we're in the process of being like, hold on, maybe that sucked. So the thing is that I don't see Trump and his people building much in the way. Elon and Vivek want to go and just like fire 80% of the civil service or whatever. That's degrading institution. That's a teardown. And they're Generation X anyway, or at least Elon is. Like, that's tearing down institutions. Or, RFK saying, okay, we're going to just ban vaccines and then allow all this quack shit. Like, that's tearing down. That's not building up. And the people who wanted to build up were the wokesters, who sort of built up over the 2010s, built up things that, frankly, were a little dysfunctional. And so I think if you want to really take Strauss and Howe's theories seriously, you've got to look at this idea of the woke revolution as the builder effort. And unfortunately, I think that kind of face planted. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves me disbelieving in long dated generational cycle theories that are difficult to assess with data. But I don't know where it should leave you, maybe depressed.
And Howe is part of a broader group of people like Peter Turchin and others who try to, do these sort of big history, this kind of thing, right?
I think Turchin's actually more right. Turchin actually has hit on something. Like, we do have a sort of a 50-year cycle of unrest. And so I think Turchin is more right. And I called the peak of unrest in 2020. And I actually, maybe Turchin and I made a bet. But in Twitter, we had an exchange back when it was Twitter. We had an exchange where he said, he did his little calculation. He said the peak could come anywhere between 2020 and 2026. And I said, 2020, that was the peak. It ain't going to get crazier than that in America. Now, we might have a world war, but we're not going to have, people like marching to the street, burning it, whatever, and people will get exhausted. I see the exhaustion setting in. And he's like, no, I think that the center of my point estimates is in 2024 as the peak of unrest. Was it though? Was 2024 the peak of unrest? We had like a few people slagging each other off on Twitter before the election. And overall, like, yes, a couple crazies tried to shoot Trump, just like a couple crazies tried to shoot Ford in 76. Right? It was almost exactly the same as when a couple crazies, and then one crazy did shoot Reagan. Right? You had some crazies just taking pot shots at a guy, and then, or no, it was 75. They tried to shoot Ford. So, but broader unrest in America was already falling by the time randos were trying to shoot Ford. Right? And especially by the time some rando shot Reagan, like, that guy was trying to prove his love to Jodie Foster. Like, he wasn't even, like, that was his whole thing. And people were like, oh, unrest is over. It's just a few random crazies out there, like, just creeping on Jodie Foster. Ultimate irony, she was gay. But anyway, so if he had only known, if we had homophobia ended up getting Reagan shot because of Jodie Foster being able to come out of the closet, that guy wouldn't have shot Reagan anyway. So that's my historical take. Anyway, but I guess the point is that I'm right, and Turchin was right in general and wrong about his specific call of the year. And I'm going to make fun of Turchin and go like, ha, Turchin, I, using your theory, was right about when the unrest fell. And it was 2020 after all. Ha, 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 ha. And then, like, that's what I'm going to say.
Well, to that end, and, I just read right before this podcast that Pierre Omidyar is funding a new resistance effort against Trump. So this might discredit, but I wonder if what I'm about to say, which is I wonder if there's a reassessing or reanalysis of sort of left-wing billionaires on their political strategies in terms of, you mentioned earlier that they've been funding a lot of these nonprofits or a lot of these political efforts that are some of the more far left efforts. And I wonder if there's sort of assessing and say, hey, those either haven't been effective or they haven't been effective functionally in terms of cities operating well, but they also haven't worked electorally, or at least not now. And so maybe those organizations will get less support, or maybe these billionaires are just hopelessly ideological and going to keep plowing, good money after bad, so to speak, the pal jobs of the world, not to actually, I don't know if that's accurate. Maybe I should take that out. Whoever these left-wing billionaires are.
I meet these guys. I hang out with these guys. I go to Hewlett Foundation stuff. They are so out of touch, it's almost painful. The one half exception is Nick Hanauer, who is sort of an insane guy, but was actually very in touch on Fight for 15. Like, that was a thing a lot of people, service workers, supported, and that united the service class. They won it, and it made minimum wage even outpace inflation for a few years. But although that's over, it's back to fight for 1050. But anyway, or something, I don't know, more than that. But anyway, Hanauer did a pretty good job, but he also spouts a lot of like absolute guff about neoliberalism. But then like all these guys like, Ahmed Yar, whatever, the Facebook guys, like not Zuckerberg because he's not very political, but like, I don't know, Chris Hughes I went to dinner with. These guys don't have any idea what's going on with the average person. Like they're so lofty, they barely have any idea what's going on with the average rich person. Like, their circles are entirely self-selected. They get to pick who hangs out with them, and who hangs out with them are always yes men asking for money, even if they've become very, very good at disguising it. People obey incentives, and if you start handing out money, you'll get grifters, and those grifters will define your socials. They're going to be like, whoa, this grifter is really interesting. This fellow isn't asking me for money. This fellow is simply having an interesting intellectual discussion. Because that fellow's entire job is to like structure their interesting intellectual discussion, so you walk away feeling smart. I could do that. I could be a grifter like that if I wanted. And I don't, because I just don't care. But I could. And these people are so damn out of touch. And then like, this is where a lot of the money for the groups is coming from. And so I don't know what to do about that other than to like make more things taxable. Because like somehow even the richest person will get very annoyed if their charitable donations are not tax deductible. So I say, just make a lot more stuff taxable and see where that takes us. And then, have some common sense restrictions on like PACs, advertising. And but until we somehow figure out how to reduce the power of the staffer class, the groups are going to have an ear. So I don't know, maybe they all listen to Econ 102. Hey, rich guys, like, don't give your money to like leftist advocacy groups. They're just going to waste it and hurt the Democratic Party. Tom Steyer needs to stop. He'll never listen to me.
His son might. He's interested in sort of moderate dumb stuff.
Honestly, what they really need to do is just like divert the money to like, YIMBYs and think tanks and stuff like that. That not like that doesn't claim to like represent a specific community. That's just more generalized stuff. You can still give your money to groups with a lowercase g, just not groups with the capital G, and that's going to be a big shift. I actually know a few rich people like that I can actually pitch this to. I'll say like, look, give your money to someone effective, and not me. I'm not saying do not give your money to me. I'll just give it to rabbits, like I do with my own money. Just give it to like some people who are trying to figure out how to like grow and build and blah blah blah. And ultimately, that's the way to win back America. It's to make appeals for things that benefit the whole country, and to wait for Trump and these guys to screw up, because like if Musk does to the civil service what he did to the employees at X, like, yes, you will eliminate a lot of inefficiency, but you also will eliminate a lot of useful stuff. And then people will get mad because like, there's stuff like my Medicare didn't get processed. Oops. Now I don't have Medicare. My veterans benefits didn't get processed. Oops. You betrayed the veterans. And so like, Finem Respice, you do this stuff, you mess around like this. I hope it's just guff, right? I hope it's like they don't end up cutting much. Except I hope they do actually fire some, useless people, and then but leave enough. You can't fire 80% of the civil servants, but maybe you could fire 20%. I don't know. I hope they do that, but I'm not optimistic, because like I saw what Elon did to X, and I don't have any trust in Vivek at all. And I think that when people get mad and like there's a massive backlash against letting guys like this screw up stuff, and everybody's getting measles because RFK said not to get vaccines. So all your kids are getting fucking measles like it's the, 19th century. Like, maybe people will realize that elections have consequences, but I hope they don't do that. I hope they just talk a big game and talk a lot of guff and then don't actually do that. But if they do it, it's going to provoke a backlash and people are going to get mad. Like, ultimately, I do believe in democracy.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Some good advice for billionaires, as well as some, reaffirming in the belief in democracy. I know this has been a great, wide-ranging discussion and a great mailbag. Thanks for everyone for submitting your questions. Please continue submitting your great questions. We'll make sure to get to them. And Noah, as always, until next time.
Until next time, sir.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and erictornberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.